Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visits Washington. What impact can we expect for China-US relations? Hello, I'm Arden Knight, and this is The Heat. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is on a three-day visit to the United States. He's holding talks with his counterpart, the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Wang Yi also met with President Biden at the White House on Friday and met with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. The Foreign Minister is promoting better communication to achieve improved China-U.S. ties.
China and the United States need to have dialogue. Not only should we resume a dialogue, the dialogue should be in-depth and comprehensive, so that with dialogue, we can increase mutual understanding, reduce misunderstandings and misjudgment, constantly seek to expand common ground and seek cooperation that will benefit to both sides, so that we can stabilize China-U.S. relations and retrieve it to the track of healthy, stable, and sustainable development.
To discuss China-U.S. relations, let's bring in our panel. From Beijing, Victor Gao is chair professor at Soochow University. From Guangzhou, Andy Mok is a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Robert Hormats is a visiting lecturer at Yale University and former U.S. Undersecretary of State. He joins us from New York and right here in our studio. Saurabh Gupta is senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to all of you. Victor, let me start with you and look at how this relationship has been progressing over the past few months. Over the summer, we saw a steady stream of United States officials visiting Beijing. They ranged from the Secretary of State, the Treasury Secretary, as well as the Commerce Secretary. Right now, we have the Governor of California, Gavin Newsom. He is in Beijing for a one-week visit. And of course, we have the Chinese Foreign Minister right now in Washington holding talks with the President and other senior officials in the Biden administration. What does this tell you? Is this a thawing of relationships, a softening perhaps?
Thank you very much for having me. I think so long as China and the United States wants to promote good relations and try to avoid a major confrontation or further deterioration of the bilateral relations, the more such high-level meetings there will be, the better. And it should not just stop with this current level of exchanges, or even, for example, the summit meeting between President Biden or President Xi Jinping on the sideline of the APEC in San Francisco very soon, next month. I personally hope there should be an exchange of state visits by President Biden to China in his official capacity, and on a reciprocal basis, President Xi Jinping's state visit to Washington. That, I hope, will really bring to a culmination of the normalization of relations between these two greatest countries in the world, the two largest economies in the world. And I think we should not stop here. We should really do our best to make sure that China and the United States will continue to work together, to get along together, to live and let live, and make sure that the world is not going out of control, or wars in different parts of the world will break out to harm the fundamental interest not only of the American people, but also of the Chinese people and people in so many other countries. Now, the great responsibility rests on the shoulder of China and the United States. Whatever we are witnessing in terms of the improvement of the relations is a very important step in the right direction. But we should not stop here. We should make bigger strides in this right direction.
And Victor, when you talk about normalization, I mean, what would you like to see in the short term?
Well, in the short term, first of all, the two countries should engage in such dialogue as frequently as possible, and either side should stop provoking the other side, especially on matters of fundamental national interest. And we should also identify a short list of red button issues, for example, and both sides need to demonstrate sensitivity and caring for the fundamental interest of the other side, rather than take great joy in provoking the other side, as if, for example, the further deterioration of the relations will work for anyone's benefit. In this context, allow me to emphasize, Governor Newsom of California made a very important visit to China. What mattered the most is this high level of pragmatism and realism that he brought to China-US relations. And I do hope more governors, more members of Congress, including senators, as well as representatives, cabinet members, for example, they need to come to China, and reciprocally, the Chinese officials need to go to Washington and other parts of the United States to see with their own eyes what these two countries are, and on a people-to-people level, the Chinese people and the American people should not be enemies against each other. We could really do so much together to make sure that the world we will be leaving for our future generations will be a better world.
Andy Mok, how do you see this relationship evolving, not just in terms of bilateral relations, but also addressing some of the major issues in the world? These are two superpowers that we are talking about right now, and we have the ongoing Ukraine conflict, we have the ongoing Israeli onslaught on Gaza. That's after Hamas attacked Israeli civilians on October the 7th. What does China bring to this?
No, that's such a great question, Anand. Let me preface this by saying that I agree with my good friend Victor Gao that the optics matter a lot, and if President Biden can visit China, there can be more high-level engagement. This is certainly important from a symbolic perspective. And Gavin Newsom's visit, not just to Beijing, but Shenzhen, I think in particular, is vitally important, and there should be much more of this with the governors, perhaps of Florida and Texas in particular. I think seeing firsthand for themselves what China's really like. And this plays into the broader geopolitical problems that you mentioned, Anand. What struck me most about Wang Yi's comments in Washington is that it is not the strongest arm or the loudest voice that determines who's right. And whatever happens, China will respond calmly. The facts will win out at the end of the day, and history will render a just verdict. So we see the problems in Ukraine and Israel, a very real risk of this escalating in potentially catastrophic ways. And I think I see echoes of this in other problems that have erupted over the years with regard to China, whether we're looking at the Uyghur situation in Xinjiang or in Hong Kong, that China's resolute and calm approach has shown its confidence in its way of thinking, its mode of solving international problems, whether this is at the UN or on a bilateral basis. And certainly these conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East have regional, local causes that really outside parties can only affect in a limited way. But that being said, I think every country certainly has an interest, and the United States and China in particular, I think, do need to take an objective, even-handed approach that does not overly focus on one side, because that's ultimately counterproductive.
Saurabh, great to have you in the studio with us. Looking at all these visits by U.S. officials to China, and now, of course, the Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Washington for very high-level talks, are we reaching something of a turning point, or is that a bit too early to say that?
I think we have reached a turning point. How important that turning point is in the larger scheme of things, it's hard to say right now, especially with 2024 being an election year. But I think how far we've come since the balloon incident, I think is a sign that the two sides really want to stabilize the relationship. You know, they talked about that in Bali last year, and frankly, the stabilization process would have moved much further had that unfortunate incident not happened. But I have seen both sides being disciplined in their communications with each other. There have obviously been exchanges of visit. We have to remember, the congressional delegation was a very important thing. Congress is the harshest branch of government when it comes to China. The Republicans are probably more anti-China than at any time since the McCarthy who lost Taiwan debate. And yet we had three Republican senators go. So I think that definitely provides cover for President Biden to engage Mr. Xi, and to see Governor Newsom go so enthusiastically at a time when a lot of people in the Beltway think we don't want to touch the Chinese with a barge pole even, and here he was going. So I think we have turned a corner.
Yeah.
I'd like to see progress at this meeting in terms of deliverables which can be achieved, but in the larger scheme of things, the election year is important, and if we have a change in government and a change in party, everything could be dissipated. So it's premature to make.
That's right. That's the 4-year cycle that we face. One other point, Saurabh, and that is China is now, you see the outreach from China in terms of making a contribution to peace around the world, to stabilizing flashpoints around the world. There was a special envoy from China in the Middle East. China also attended the peace summit that took place in Cairo right after this latest round of fighting between the Israelis and the Palestinians. What do you make of that?
I think it's welcome. I don't think, again, we should be getting too far ahead out here. China it's important that China shoulder public goods burden in terms of international security responsibilities. China comes in with different perspectives on these matters, and so it helps sort of balance the conversation rather than if just one party, the West, was there and trying to dictate events. And the West has leverage, but up to a point only. It's important, but also we must understand China's leverage and ability in certain situations is limited. Its policies also go up to a point, and it's not going to necessarily support certain policies with regard to even in terms of what's happening today in the Middle East. But I think it's a trend that ought to be welcomed. Good to see China, and it's done it in Afghanistan. Myanmar also tried to be a facilitator as such, rather than get beyond. But I would submit the best thing China and the US can do is stabilize their relationship. Right. I think that is the ultimate public good for the global system.
Robert Hormats, great to have you with us. We have seen rising tensions between the two countries, China and the United States, over the past few years. But there have also been efforts to ease those tensions. Where do you think it's heading right now?
Well, I think that it is heading in a much more positive way than it was 6 months ago or so. The tone in Washington was sort of an angry tone. Politicians thought they were getting a lot of political credit with their constituents by making tough statements on China. I think that was totally counterproductive in the relationship and achieved nothing, and was unhealthy in terms of moving ahead on difficult issues. Now I think we're seeing a very different and much better tone with all these visits. The Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Commerce, John Kerry, Schumer, and now Governor Newsom. I think this is a very important signal to the American people that senior politicians on both sides, the Chinese side and the American side, thought that the anger of the debate had gone too far, and they want to pull it back for two reasons. One, because they understand that really nothing can get done of significance in the global economic system or the global political system or on global security issues without China and the US working together. And second, because I think they want to signal to the American public that we need to work with China. We need to find areas of cooperation with China, and there are several. The environment is one. Cooperation we've had for years on medical and health issues, major breakthroughs between American scientists and Chinese scientists on key issues. Right. And there are a whole range of other issues where we can and need to work together to avoid this deteriorating and to continue what I think is now a positive direction. And I'm very happy that the Chinese leaders and the American leaders have decided on ways of working together and improving this dialogue.
And Robert, what about domestic political considerations rather, and how it impacts the relationship between China and the United States? I mean, Saurabh just mentioned a moment ago that the harshest branch of the United States government when it comes to this relationship is the United States Congress. And recently, we had two Republican representatives that criticized the White House for hosting the Chinese foreign minister. They described it as a weakness on the part of the Biden administration. I mean, to what extent does this deeply polarized political environment that we are in right now hinder better relations?
Well, it is harmful. It is harmful. First of all, negotiation and working together is not a sign of weakness. I think it's a sign of understanding the world as it is today, where you have two major powers with enormous human talent and a lot of capabilities deciding that they want to work together. And I don't see that as a sign of weakness. I see it as a sign of positive progress. And I applaud the leaders on both sides who have seen it in much the same way. I think the politics in the U.S. have been unhelpful, but that is largely in Washington. If you go to various parts of the country, you don't see that in the same way. The farm community likes to work with the Chinese. They sell a lot of grain to China and other products. California, technological cooperation, entertainment cooperation, and agricultural cooperation. In New York, Chuck Schumer went, and the U.S. And the Chinese financial communities, and of course New York's the center of the U.S. financial community, have been working together. So I actually think that if you go out to the various parts of the country, there's a much more positive view of China than there is in Washington. Washington, I think it's political rhetoric. In various parts of the country, it's practical cooperation. And I think most people who understand China, I've been going since 1972 when I was Dr. Kissinger's advisor as we were just beginning the relationship.
Right.
I was convinced at that point, as I am convinced now, that the two countries actually can work together and that the world will be a far better place if they find ways of doing that. And certainly they need to find ways of avoiding a deterioration. And I think they're working to do that, and I think they've made a lot of progress to avoid further deterioration and move the path on toward greater progress. And I'm delighted because I've spent a lot of my lifetime in doing this and trying to achieve this progress. And now I see Tony Blinken and Janet Yellen and a number of other people. And I think the president at some point is going to realize that being negative to China doesn't help him politically, and working with China will be an asset.
Yeah, Victor, we've been talking about the visit by the California Governor Gavin Newsom to China. He's going to be there for a week, as I said. Well, he's been talking to the media, and this is some of what he had to say. Let's listen.
Some people see the world from a scarcity frame, zero sum. I don't. I say the more successful China is, the more successful we all will be. It's just about competition, raises everyone's game, but zero sum, I completely reject that framework.
So, Victor, listening to Gavin Newsom there, do you think that is something of a message he's sending to the current administration?
I hope so. And I do believe that Governor Newsom's message to the White House, to the Beltway in Washington, D.C., and to the American people at large will be viewed as a very positive one. Why? Because he's talking about the truth. He's talking about what he's seen in China, what is gathered, talking with the Chinese leaders, not only in Beijing, but elsewhere in China. And I think he is being very pragmatic and very realistic. And I think this is exactly what's needed. Now, we also talked about the U.S. Congress. I have a dream of bringing all members of the Congress, both in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, to visit China every year so that they can have a better understanding of what China is. As Governor Newsom is telling the American people, I do believe that Governor Newsom is acting for the best interest of the American people, of the people in California, and for the businesses of all kinds in the United States. In the world of today, China is a fact. China is a megatrend. You need to accept that as a fact, rather than to fight against it for mutual destruction. And I do hope Governor Newsom will be viewed very positively in the United States for his courage, vision, and wisdom of telling the American people about the truth about China.
Andy, we've seen a lot of reports over the past few weeks on the likelihood of a meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Biden at the APEC meeting, which takes place next month, on the sidelines of that meeting. There was an op-ed which was published in the South China Morning Post, and it was written by Stephen Roach of Yale University. And he said that that likely meeting, which will take place in San Francisco, will be mainly a photo op. But what must follow that meeting is the creation of China-US working groups to move the relationship forward, to deal with things in details, on a detailed basis. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with him. I think that certainly if there is a meeting in San Francisco, it will be a fantastic photo op, but we shouldn't discount that. Again, the optics matter, symbolism matters a lot. I would, though, strike a note of caution in that at the same time, the U.S. is making very serious efforts at multiple levels to engage with China publicly. At the same time, behind the scenes, it is also looking to discourage American investment in China. And of course, we've seen new semiconductor restrictions as well. So I think this is very, very counterproductive and frankly undermines American competitiveness, as I think we've seen Governor Newsom mention as well. You know, some of the most important companies in California are the semiconductor companies, and they are losing out. NVIDIA's CEO has mentioned his concern about losing access to the China market, which would undermine their ability to invest in R&D. So I think this is an important consideration to bear in mind. The other thing about APEC too is, of course, I think that technology is going to be one of the topics discussed, and semiconductors is a very important part of that. With regard to working groups, we're already seeing, I think, very good progress. Secretary of Treasury Yellen said that with the financial working groups, that I believe in her words, that the U.S.-China relationship has moved past a dangerous phase. So certainly, I think these lower-level engagements are happening at the national level, and if they're complemented by more subnational engagement on the U.S. side in particular, I think that's important. The last thing I want to say is that voices like Michael Mafal, who's I believe the most critical in terms of criticizing this engagement with China, I think really it represents outdated and obsolete thinking, and I'm optimistic long term because when we look at this by age cohort, certainly younger people have a much more realistic understanding of the United States in the world today, and I think no longer have this notion of a hegemonic, the U.S. is and should be number one. So I think in the long term, we do have some cause for optimism, but in the short term, there is still some concern.
You know, Sarah, one of the words we heard very often in the last few months was decoupling. The United States talking about decoupling from the Chinese economy. That was recast as de-risking. Now, many analysts see that as sort of code language for containing China, for blocking its rise, continuing rise as an economic power. Is that something that's going to be addressed by the foreign minister when he's here?
I don't think so. I know both. The United States is going to try to reassure China that we are not seeking decoupling. In every visit that has happened, Blinken, Raimondo, Yellen, I think even Secretary Kerry said, we are not seeking to decouple. And they talk in terms of supply chain resilience and certain national security elements. I'm not totally believing in that. I think there is a tendency to seek selective decoupling, and actually those in the Republican Party who would like to make it a much more broader decoupling. Well, the Europeans genuinely are de-risking in terms of lessening the overdependence in the relationship. But I think there are useful areas where this summit can achieve deliverables. I think they're talking about a 1.5 track on AI, setting up a working group. Yeah. I think that's absolutely doable. I think they will probably have agreements. I'm hoping China will agree to restart mill conversations. That's the one working group which has not happened. I think there's a chance to tee up something on fentanyl also. Both sides know what they want. They're speaking in a working group. I don't know where the situation is, so they could do something on fentanyl. The one area I think they will not realize forward progress is on their science and technology agreement, which is due to expire or temporarily renewed. But I'm hoping the two presidents will invest their political capital to see that this does get done down the line.
Robert Holmans, I've just got a couple of minutes left, but I want to talk about technology. Particularly, we've heard that the foreign minister, the visiting foreign minister, Wang, will try to get the restrictions that have been put on sales of semiconductors to China lifted. But if we look at what's happened recently, the US doubled down on these restrictions to block the sale of its semiconductors to China. Officials said it wants to, they want to close down loopholes to the existing arrangements. Where do you see that go?
Well, I think there is a view in Washington that high technology is both an economic matter and has security implications as well. And I think that's one of the difficulties. If it were just that the high technology that was being sold was an economic phenomenon that boosted economic trade and investment, I think the emotions wouldn't be as great as they are, because a lot of people, including people in the Pentagon and other parts of the administration, think that if you sell China high technology, it will be used not just for economic purposes, but for security purposes. And I think that that's what has clouded the debate or confused the debate or crossed the lines in the debate, so it's blurred the lines. I think one of the conversations that's required is to try to figure out a way that we can develop a security relationship of trust so that people are not as concerned that technology will be used for adverse purposes by either side. And I think what we need to do is try to figure out how to, in Jake Sullivan's words, find a way where there are almost certainly going to be some restrictions, but minimize those restrictions to the point that they're not going to interfere with a wider range of technology which has economic purposes but not security purposes. Somewhere along the lines of that debate, it's important. And I think trust is important and conversations are important. And the more of these bilateral conversations occur, the higher the level of trust. And I think the greater the prospect of avoiding undue interference in technology that does not have security concerns attached to it, but it's simply an economic phenomenon.
Okay, and that is where we are going to have to leave it. We've run out of time. That is it for this edition of The Heat. Thank you to everyone for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.